Why have I survived? Because I am a creature more devious than all the other me's put together. Because I saw myself bleeding out, and instead of checking for a pulse, I began collecting her things. I survived the desert like a coyote survives, like all tricksters do.
Hello, listener. Dukes here, and welcome to part 2 of our summer reading series here on Upper Middle Brow. We're going to get right into this conversation, but I just wanted to give you a heads up that both Chris and my recordings didn't turn out super well for this one. We both had technical glitches. For those of you who are audio nerds, I was on a trip staying somewhere and I forgot my mic cable, so I had to record with my built-in microphone in a pretty echoey environment. That didn't turn out too great. And Chris had an issue that we thought we had solved where his computer ignored the input from his very nice podcasting microphone and instead recorded him with a tiny little built-in microphone on the laptop. So he sounds kind of echoey too. Fortunately, our guests were super professional and made really beautiful recordings. They are two former colleagues of mine from WBEZ, Arionne Nettles, who doesn't work there anymore, and Susie and Ari, who still does work there. And we asked them each to recommend a summer reading book for adults this time. Not necessarily adult literature, although one of them, it's got some adult themes. So they're going to just introduce themselves, and then we're going to get right into the recommendations. So we're going to start with Arionne Nettles.
I am Arionne Nettles. I live in Chicago, and I am a lecturer and the director of audio journalism programming at Northwestern University's Medill School, which is a really, really long way to say that I am an audio nerd there. So I'm really excited to always do more audio stuff. And I am a slightly book nerd. I do a lot of reading, especially now that I am also a PhD student. And so I'm really excited to talk about summer reads because I get to go in the total opposite direction away from academic reading, which is really good. Like I've read some really good stuff this year, but this made me think about the purely fun stuff.
Well, hold that thought. I want to ask a question about the notion of summer reading too, which I feel like it's a concept that comes from, I don't know, high school, for a lot of us, but I think a lot of us adults like keep it. Yeah, Susie, who are you?
I am Susie and I also live in Chicago, and I am an editor at WBEZ, Chicago's NPR news station. I'm an editor for the Curious City podcast, which is where we get questions from listeners and we investigate the answers. I feel like I'm more of a book follower, maybe. I feel like I'm rarely the person who's giving the recommendations. I'm more like receiving the recommendations and really just following the trends.
Same.
Not a trendsetter.
That's how I feel too. I mean, if you notice our podcast, like I think the average year of publication is like 1992 too. Like we're not a like with it, like what's the new books podcast. We're like, let's go back and read this thing from 1992. What I wanted to start with, Ari, you started to allude to this, but I'm just curious, do both of you actually still, is the notion of summer reading like still a relevant concept for you in your lives? Like is what you would choose to read over the summer different than what you'll read during the other parts of the year?
So yes and no, because I think I used to really only look at summer reads as beach reads, and I really did used to read a lot of those books, right? Like the woman left her husband, or he died. That's usually a common theme. Or he was cheating on her, and he died. Like some combination of that. She goes off to Tybee Island off of Savannah, or she goes to the Hamptons, or it depends on how much money she got. Depends on what body of water she's near, and then that depends on like what type of man
sometimes she wins
falls
a
in love
prize
with.
too. Like I'm familiar with it. Like sometimes there's like some kind of
or
like,
sometimes she invests, right? She buys a little cottage, or she, if she had a rich husband who cheated on her and died, though, he probably left her a cottage that she never visited or a place she didn't know about, right? It's all these same themes.
Yeah.
And those are very predictable beach reads, which I still like, but I probably don't read as many of those. But those used to be like, oh, this is a beach read. Now, I do know for me, like my summers are slower in a different way. And so I would say that I do read more in the summer. And so I do maybe have time to not push as many things to my to be read list in the summer. So I do read differently, but mostly because I got more time. So it's not necessarily just the type. It's usually stuff I would have read anyways, but I just maybe got the time to do it versus like for me, for example, I don't have PhD classes over the summer. So I'm like, okay, well, all these big books I've been reading every week, I'm not reading those. So I'm going to replace those times with other books that I really want to read.
summer is the time you get to catch up on the books you're looking forward to reading.
Yeah. But I definitely used to think that like, oh, I'm going to go on like a beachy vacation and I need a beach book. But I actually don't often even get the beach vacations I wish I was having as much anymore.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
Yeah, Ari, what are you studying in your PhD program that you're using the summer to get away from?
oh, yes, educational leadership. So
Yeah, those are some big
a
books.
lot of and some of them are like really good though. And I would say education is probably one of the only PhDs you get where I don't want to say only, but it really is interdisciplinary. So like one week I might be reading a book from MLK. Another week I'm reading something that's specifically about education. Another week I'm reading something about social spaces, right? So it kind of talks about all these different things that affect people in education, whether it is like K through 12 or higher education. And so it really does kind of run the gamut, but sometimes they're like, well, not sometimes, but most of the time they're really heavy books. And so generally I'm reading like a book a week, not to count like the other articles and stuff that you read on top of that, but it's a lot of reading.
That's the time when you want some of those books to hopefully be on Audible so that you can listen at twice the speed, right?
I know.
Like,
And then, but
you
then
wish.
you can't,
Or while
you
you're
know,
commu-
then
or while
you
you're
can't
commuting.
like, yeah, then you can't highlight. So
right.
I'll try to do like the books I love maybe on Audible while I'm commuting, and then when I like sit down, so that's when I can sneak in the books that I don't have time for.
You're such a good student.
Yeah. Well, so the book we're talking about today, I actually listened to it on Audible because I was so busy and I was so stressed, but it was just such a, this is fun, compared to everything else in my life.
I'm reading it on like an ebook reader, and like my first thought was like, oh, I really want to hear the audiobook of this because I was like, first of all, this is warm. This is a
yes.
It's steamy. I read the first chapter. Yeah.
Yes.
love it.
I read the first like 30 seconds. I was like, hold on, let me rewind this.
Yeah.
What just happened? Did what I think happened? Whoa. And, our good friend Greta actually recommended this book to me. And she's like, I think you'll like it. And I text her, Greta, what is happening in this? I said, I like it, but I was taken aback. But I mean, to be clear, I really am enjoying this book, but it just, whoa.
Greta Johnson of Nerdette is a sex positive reader. I've seen this.
Yes,
like she appreciates a steamy book or a steamy movie. She's on record. That's documented on the Nerdette podcast. But yeah, there is some sex.
Don't be ashamed of it.
Right,
Yes.
right. And also, like, I read the first chapter and it does start out very steamy, but then you also realize very quickly that it's a heavy book too. But we're getting ahead. We're getting ahead. I want to hear Susie's answer to the summer reading. Like, Susie, is this like still a relevant concept in your life, or do you just read year round the same way?
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of the summer read, like just kind of what Ari was talking about, like, a relaxing read on the beach. But I've come to realize for me, it's sort of, I just want to read a piece of fiction. And for me, that's not, I don't want to read something like a heavy, but probably really good nonfiction book over the summer. It could be a heavy fiction read. I don't know why that really even matters, but for me, it's just sort of like there's a bit of an escape there. And then I've come to realize that's just sort of how I think of reading year round. And then every once in a while, if there is like a good nonfiction book, I'll read it. But it doesn't have to be summer, winter, or whatever. It's just sort of year round.
Fair enough. As you both are talking, I'm reminded that probably one of my first introductions to this concept was being at the beach in North Carolina when I was probably 16 or so. And both my mom and my aunt would always talk about like having her beach trash, and she would just like go out on the beach all day, sit there and read a paperback. And they were both reading a book that was called An Inconvenient Woman, which I think sort of fits both of I think it's the sort of genre that Arionne described, although it might have been sort of like a romance thriller too, but it was definitely not supposed to be a like hard to read book. And definitely its pleasures weren't purely intellectual. So Susie, we've alluded to all of this already. We were already chatting about your book and Ari's book, but will you just tell us what book you chose and give us a short description of that?
Sure. I chose The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson. So it's a on its face, it's a sci-fi novel that delves into the multiverse. And this was before the multiverse was really like this big, cool thing that, is in every movie now. Our main character is this woman, Kara, who is able to jump between different universes. And it's like this technology that in her universe only exists. And basically, when you jump to another universe, you can only do that if your other self of that world is already dead. And Kara is sort of like this talented traverser because so many of her other selves in all the other worlds are dead. But, through this, she discovers in one multiverse, a secret that kind of connects her from her original world, and a secret that ominous music puts the entire multiverse in danger. Which, okay, so this sounds like some, whatever sci-fi novel, but it also like just does such a great job getting into commentary about wealth and poverty and privilege and race and resources, and just like being a human that faces a lot of ethical choices, and just sort of, you as a person in different situations, would you be a terrible person? You don't fully know yourself as much as you think. And I chose it as a summer read because to me, it kind of gives like sort of that feeling of a big summer blockbuster.
Right.
Like, Marvel Universe, but smarter. And I'm not throwing any shade to Marvel Universe. I've watched all of the movies, but it's that, but like just so smart with the commentary, and the writing is just so good.
I read the first chapter or two, and the reason that Kara can travel, you explained it, but part of what she explains is that on her home world, or on the world that she's traveling from, people who are privileged, and there's sort of the same racial injustice that we have in our world too. And so I don't remember exactly how she describes her race or ethnicity, but she's non-white. She's a person of color, and that she's poor. She comes from a poor family from a marginalized area. And so part of the reason that the other versions of her are dead on the other worlds is because her background is such that she doesn't have a very good chance of living. So it's just laden with that kind of meaning that you're talking about, race, class. And the woman that she works with, who she sort of has a crush on, can't travel to other worlds because she's from a wealthy background and all of the other versions of her are alive. And so they have this kind of interesting relationship that's based on like a little bit of flirtation and also this like yawning chasm of class awareness. And then the other thing I found really fascinating about this book is this notion of like passing and being an imposter. And we learn in the second chapter that Kara is like literally an imposter in a very specific way, but then she's also an imposter in other very prosaic ways that we could be familiar with in our world, like the way somebody from a particular class who has become class mobile and successful in another world can feel like an imposter and in fact crafts a new identity for herself. And I don't know, I listened to many of the episodes of your podcast, Shoes Off, a sexy Asian podcast, and it seems like that theme of imposterdom, it seems like that's part of that podcast too. So I was just wondering if that was one of the things that drew you to the book too, this sense of somebody kind of making sense of being an imposter in a number of different ways.
Yeah, and I guess in a way it's sort of like she takes that idea, but it's almost like she does it at least outwardly towards the people that she is relating with or associating with, that she takes that idea and has such confidence in like kind of going about whatever world she's in that sort of imposter way. Like it's not, whereas like maybe imposter syndrome of what we think of for ourselves might feel very vulnerable. For her, I feel like Kara has just such like a command of things where it's like she struggled with herself and she knows that. And so she's just kind of like, I've hit rock bottom. How much further can I really go? So she just kind of like revels in that sort of imposterdom.
There's no guilt. It's like, I'm an imposter and I'm going to be a good imposter because I need to be an imposter in order to survive and in order to achieve the goals that I have. And she doesn't seem to feel guilty, although I've only gotten maybe a third of the way through the book. And that's actually one of the questions is like, is something going to happen to make her feel guilty at any point? I don't know. And I guess both of you, Susie, Ari's read this book too. So both of you know the answer to that.
Susie really hit it on the head when you said the word privilege, because that's the word that I always think about when I'm thinking about this book. Because it really was kind of ahead of its time, because the Marvel multiverse hadn't been discovered yet, right? People had talked about, there's going to be probably a multiverse, but it was before the Spider-Man movie where everybody was like, oh, no, this confirms that the multiverse is real. The fact that I know that, I don't know how. But yes, so the book was before that. And so it's kind of this weird thing where just like today or in real life, we know that we could like technically feed everybody, but we don't. Do y'all remember the video blew up during the pandemic, but this comedian, Vinny Thomas, he did like Earth's application to like the world galactic, the universe galactic thing, and he was asking like about, so everybody in the world.
You mean you
right?
still have poor people?
Right. He was like, logistics. Because of logistics, you want me to write down logistics, right? And so it's kind of like, it's but also I think I really like books that don't they make you feel something, but they don't like tell you how to feel, and they don't make it, it's obvious, but it's not obvious in that way, right? It's not like everyone is poor here and everyone is rich here, right? Like you just clearly know by the descriptions on how people live and the opportunities they have, how they grew up, and like what their future is or could be. And you just, so it just feels really real. I don't think I've read a lot of sci-fi that feels as real as this book.
Yeah, and it's just like with like the privilege and resources. I mean, like, you think of the people who live in the book. There's this place, Wiley City. That's where everyone with like all the resources and the wealthy people live, and people who live in like the wasteland or like rural areas. You're basically you're beholden to the daylight hours, so like you're literally going to get burnt by the sun if you are exposed to the sun outside of Wiley City. And it's like this idea that like, that means your every movement is sort of dictated by where you live, and you have to like think about like how you can just your basic human movements when you're not in Wiley City where all the resources are. It's just so interesting, like environmental segment there of the book too, that she doesn't quite like, she doesn't hit you over the head with it, but like just how all of it is just sort of woven together, because it is all part, like everything that we have in our lives, it's all woven together, and she just writes it so well into it, where it's not like I'm in this sci-fi novel, I am telling you about privilege and you must hear that there are these divisions here, but it's just like woven in so well with like the environment of where people are living in the book, and it's just so interesting to read that.
Well, I was going to say, Susie, what you're describing, like we just wrapped up Parable of the Sower, and that also really plays with ideas of like what would happen if issues of like class and race were sort of expanded beyond what a privileged set of people is used to. And what you're describing really makes me think of that book in the same way of like, I mean, it's what are the things that are afforded to you through privilege or lack of privilege, and what happens when we play with the slider. Like I think the genius of Parable of the Sower is like takes like 90% of the population and is like, this is what it's like to live in poverty, even if you're like ostensibly middle class. And it becomes, it's an interesting question for these books. I haven't read Space Between Worlds, just because Jesse and I split this up in terms of our responsibilities for this one. But it sounds, when was it published? I'm interested to see where it sits in the multiverse canon.
Well, yes, it was indeed before the whole Spider-Man multiverse thing, and that kind of makes me mad, because I feel like this would be a really great movie, and then this would come out as a movie, and people would be like, "Oh, you're copying Spider-Man." I think this was like 2021,
okay,
mid 2021. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, maybe even 2020.
According to Goodreads, it was August 2020, so that would track.
Okay.
But I will point out, multiverse it's an old concept in sci-fi. Like that concept is an old idea in physics, and maybe Hollywood and Marvel have figured out. I mean, Marvel Comics were doing it for a long time, but Star Trek, the original series, which I haven't watched a whole lot, but famously they would sometimes go to a kind of alternative universe version where like Kirk was bad and Spock had a beard, and it was sort of like Mirror World, like the idea was like, what if the people you're seeing in the mirror are they're part of their own? But it's not like it's a particularly new idea. I feel like Ms. Johnson, she's doing it in a very, very clever way, and she's using it to surface themes, that Star Trek in 1962 wasn't surfacing. So it definitely feels very fresh and new.
And I would also say like the idea of like the multiverse recently is sort of like not just going into one or two other universes, parallel universes, but it's like an explosion of universes. So like, in the Space Between Worlds, they talk about how Kara is like dead on like, more than 300 other worlds. And then you think of like, Everything Everywhere All at Once, they go into like a whole, they get like zapped into a whole bunch of other worlds. And like, so this idea of just like, a true multiverse, not just like one or two parallel worlds, and like the chaos of like maybe when there is a point where they kind of converge. I feel like that has become more popular, like, that's happened with Spider-Man, with Doctor Strange, which I didn't think it was very good. And so that's why, again, I feel
Didn't
like,
see it.
man, why didn't you guys, this book would actually be the much better one to explore the multiverse. But again, I will concede the Marvel universe for all their billions of dollars.
They're making a lot of money, that's for sure.
Jesse, we have here's our chance for our obligatory Larry Niven moment.
It's like a drinking game.
It is like a drinking game. For whatever reason, like, it's so weird that Larry Niven, who is like a pretty good science fiction writer, surfaces all these times. There's a short story of his called All the Myriad Ways, which is about, and I think it's set in, I don't know, it's probably set in the 60s or 70s, kind of when Niven is writing. But like a discovery of like parallel universes has been made, and all that it results in is like a huge rash of suicides. Because everybody is sort of like, oh, I'm like living somewhere else. So, and like the sort of recurring theme of the story is why not? And it's like, I remember reading it when this is the problem when your like dad is a like hard sci-fi reader, and you just like grab the books that's on a shelf. And I remember reading it when I was like 13, being like, oh my God, this is not suitable reading for a 13-year-old. But
yeah, the last time you also reached for a sort of Larry Niven short story was also very bleak, having about like 12 hours left to live and figuring out what to do or how to survive a supernova or something like that.
I mean, there's this period of sci-fi when like all the ideas were kind of like basic. And I think we're at this stage of like speculative fiction where people are starting to ask much more interesting questions.
And the horror, I mean, I know enough of this book too to know that Kara, she's fascinated with a world in which she's not dead and where her version of her is actually doing very well and is very successful. And it sort of reminds you, like maybe of that college classmate who's a lot more successful than you, even though you thought you were maybe the smarter person in whatever class you took together or something like the horror of what might have been and what might have been available to you if only you had been a little bit smarter or more energetic. I think Arionne is like the best possible version of Arionne at a young age. I'm trying to imagine what the amazing version of you.
I would be way more put together. But this does, or at least like the privilege part or like the successful part of it, even though it doesn't have multiverses in it, something y'all said earlier reminded me of this newer book called Goliath by Tochi Onyebuchi. And that book is the opposite, where like Earth has become inhabitable and people who have the money have like left to like colonize like Mars and stuff. Like they're like colonizing other places. And so here on Earth, there's like, you have to like live in a bubble to be able to breathe. Like you need like space because like it's so like climate change has like made it so bad that the people who had money was like, peace out, I'm living someplace else. So it's kind of like the opposite.
Let's shift over to Arionne's book. So you've recommended You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty by Akwaeke Emezi.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about the book and tell us why you are recommending this as a summer read?
Yes, and so I triple checked the summary to make sure that I'm not giving out any spoilers, okay? But our main character, Faye, she has experienced some grief pretty young in her life. She's in her 20s. But with this grief, she's trying to like figure out love and what that means for her, but she's like really hurting, and she meets this guy. He's pretty cool, should he be her boyfriend? She doesn't really know. He's really nice though, and she goes to visit him on this beautiful island that he's from, and she meets his dad. She's like, whew, that man is fine, okay? And that is gonna be a problem. And most of the book is about this problem.
That's a variation on the like go to the island that I don't think I've ever heard of before in the romance genre. It's new.
Yeah. Yeah,
like
but I had to double check because I was like, I don't want to spoil that
So
part.
we don't know what happens with the dad, but we know that she is
Yeah.
intrigued by the dad.
She's intrigued by this older gentleman.
But the book does have a certain amount, like the BOOK has a certain amount of sex, at least based on...
Yes.
Right.
Yes. It's a lot of people having a lot of sex in this book.
Yeah.
And I think, though, like, it's one of the things I like about it, right? Like, I think it, like, sometimes you need a book to, like, snap you out of your prudeness, you know? To be like, whoop, okay, all right, that's what we're reading, you know? And so sometimes I really like a good steamy read every now and then. Because it also makes me think about, like, just how we interact with each other. And I think that one thing I really like about this particular book is that it's really non-traditional in how it approaches relationships. So, you know, if you're reading older romance novels, it's like there's a man and there's a woman, right? Maybe there's another man or another woman and there's like a triangle, and then, you know, you're confused. Then newer books, people started introducing like gay and queer characters, but it'll be like very textbook, like this is how this gay person is, right? And I, especially, you know, like I know that I am not a young person anymore, but like somebody Faye's age especially, I think that they don't necessarily view sex and gender in the same way that older people and older generations have. And so a lot of people are like, I am attracted to people, I'm attracted to personalities, I'm attracted to more than one thing. And I think that this book approaches it as if that's normal, and it doesn't make it be a thing, you know? So like, for example, there's a male character and he has nail polish on. Well, for one, that could mean anything. It could just mean that he likes nail polish. But it's like they don't make it a thing like, well, the man had nail polish on. Right. And, you know, normally men would, you know, they don't make it a thing, right? It's just that like if you create a character, have the character be themselves and just let whatever play out that's gonna play out. And so it feels more real life in that way, where it is complicated sometimes, it is messy sometimes, right? And so I think that there is no, this is the gay best friend, this is the so-and-so, right? Like, you know, like those kind of traditional tropes that are easy to fall into when you are trying to like expand past what those traditional romance novels are. And I was, you know, so I was reading, I was like, wow, this is really different, because I love a steamy novel. And I was like, this one really pushes the boundaries in some fun ways.
Yeah, as I was reading it, like, you know, I mean, first of all, like I didn't know it was a romance novel when I started, and then I very quickly knew it was a romance novel.
I didn't either, because I didn't read the summary. I just liked the title.
Like in
and
the,
like,
I think it's
there's
the
like this
first
moment where
sentence you figure
flip
it out,
the
right?
book over and you're like, what? Does it say romance novel? And you're like, no, it's just literature. But I mean, like what you're saying, you know, what they're doing is like in a lot of like traditional like novels and storytelling, like all the obstacles are there to like evince the character's personality. And what Emezi seems to be doing in this book is using the sex as a way to evince the development of Faye in a way that's just totally, it's so frank. It's so wonderfully like sex positive and very, it's like you said, it's not making a point about the sex. That's just part of the landscape. And, you know, her best friend is gay, but isn't drawn in any of the ways that we usually associate the gay best friend character. She sort of pushes straight past the tropes because, you know, one of the big questions of the romance novel is like, are they going to do it? And like right away, you're like, oh, they're doing it like right now.
Yeah. And then you're like, okay, but what does that mean? And honestly, there's a lot of tension between two of the characters where they have not had any sex, but they've had all of these intimate moments that have drawn them together. And like, that is the most tense thing, right? You know, when people talk about like Bridgerton, for example, you know, when I think that was the second season of Bridgerton that everybody, I don't want to say everybody, but people complained that there was not enough sex in that second season, because what really was like, I think a lot of the tension there was like he loves her, but he hates her, but he really loves her. And it's like this tension. It's like, you drive me crazy type back and forth. And that's what people really went crazy for. And so I think that it's just a reminder that like there are other forms of intimacy outside of sex. So it's kind of like, it's very sex positive, because it shows that like you can have sex that means something. You can have sex that doesn't mean anything in that way, but that you wanted to have it and you had it. But then also there are other ways to create intimacy. So that's also like a different way versus like, I think sometimes a romance novel leans very heavily on sex early, like kind of like midpoint, and then it's like some fake barrier pops up, like, I can't believe you didn't tell me that you were moving to DC and I am here in LA, and you know, and then they eventually make up and everything's fine, right?
There's going to be an airport or train station in that particular scenario.
Exactly, but they've already had sex, so they need some other type of drama, because
you got to raise it somehow.
Raise the stakes up by putting something artificial in between them.
Exactly. Versus like, you know, you can go really far in storytelling without even having sex if that's not, you know, what happened. So I think it's just, I really love that. And I think even like the idea, I was surprised at how much grief played out in this book. So, you know, Faye is an artist, and she really kind of infuses grief in a way that is very interesting. And open, and kind of also like cracks her open vulnerably. So she's like working on this art and being like very vulnerable at the same time that she's being put in these really vulnerable situations. And so like the juxtaposition of that for me was really, really like, that's when I was like, oh wow, I can't put this book down. So yeah, it just did something to me. And I do love steamy books, but it was like, this was more than just a good steamy read.
Yeah, totally. Like there's a moment in the second or third chapter when it's just like not even a throwaway sentence, but she's like, she wondered if she would have thought about this if she wasn't thinking about broken glass and lilacs or something. It's just like a beautiful moment of like, you know, the visuals of the crash. They do such a marvelous job of, it's such a tasteful book because like you're saying, the sex part about it isn't the important part. The important part is the connection and the emotions. And it's just such a great way to kind of be like, oh, you think you're here for sex. You're actually here for intimacy.
Exactly. Because like the first couple pages, you might think this is some 50 Shades of Grey or something. And it is totally not that. It is very relationship based, like, how people are. And I also really love books where like nobody is a villain. Like nobody is a pure villain in this book. You know, people do some bad things. Sometimes people argue, which is also something that I am starting to find. Like I was telling my therapist actually, like I was like, I'll get really upset because like the last couple years, if like a relationship or a romantic relationship doesn't work out, I get maybe upset, maybe I'm disappointed. I'm like, but surprisingly, I'm not angry anymore. Like I used to maybe would be angry. I was like, but I'm not really angry because usually I'm like, people were just doing the best that they could with whatever they had in whatever situation that they were, and I'm not really mad at it. Like I'm disappointed, but I'm not mad. I felt like this book kind of rounded that out where people would do something and I'm like, how dare you say that? But then, you know, it was very careful not to paint someone as just an evil person, even if they were hurt or upset.
That is, I mean, it's not that I read a lot of romance, but I've read some. And, you know, if I think about Jane Austen, usually there's like the good guy and the bad guy. And the plot is always some version of she's attracted to the bad guy and then figures out it should be the good guy.
Yeah, especially in a rom-com. Even
Right.
like in, it has to be that they're, or like, she got back with the ex, but the ex was a bad person. Like I just saw, I mean, this is totally different, but like even I saw The Little Mermaid over the weekend, but it just reminded me of like the point. It was amazing.
All right.
But it reminds me of the point where Prince Eric, Ursula has turned into this beautiful woman and is tricking Prince Eric to think that the beautiful voice was coming from her. And so, but she kind of looks evil, right? And you're like, don't date that evil woman. You're supposed to be with Ariel, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of like always like that. Even if the person isn't like an actual sea witch or octopus, they are like the evil woman or man. So sometimes it's the ex, right, that pops back up into the picture, and then it's like, you're not supposed to be with that, and then somebody's best friend was like, you need to go after him or her, like that's your right, and then that's when you have the big scene, and so it's just always, it has to be generally like a bad person, and this does not have any bad people, and you don't want anybody to get hurt, but life is messy and people's feelings get hurt.
It feels like a lot of the movies I'm familiar with, I feel like it's often like the wrong guy is a sort of like rich but shallow, as opposed to being like an octopus sea witch. But but still, it's like Rob Lowe in Wayne's World, which was a very important movie when I was a teenager too. His character, or Bill Pullman in was it Sleepless in Seattle? I think so. Remember. Although he is actually that guy, I don't know if you remember that movie. He is sort of an okay guy, just the wrong one for Meg Ryan, as I recall. It has that complexity. The thing I'm thinking about now as you're talking too is I realize like the thing I really admire, and I'm actually not thinking of very many books that do this well. I can think of some movies, maybe because you rely on actors and you rely on visuals, is really create the sense of realistic attraction between two people without sex. Like I remember I watched Witness, the Harrison Ford film from the 1980s with Kelly McGillis, who Chris has obscure connection with. Shares an acting credit with, I believe.
Me too, yeah.
And Kelly McGillis is a Amish woman and Harrison Ford is a non-Amish man, and they're in the same place. And there's this like romance and tension between them that grows and builds and builds and builds. And to me, it feels like very real and very steamy. And it's almost like a letdown when that is sort of like realized, like the build is kind of what makes it great, and that does feel very realistic, and you sort of feel like, oh, if I were in that moment, I would, like totally relate to what these characters are feeling right now. And I think that's actually really hard to do in a book. I think a lot of times you have romance in a book, there's some sort of hint that one character has a crush on the other, or it's just sort of like, I don't know, you're just meant to accept it. So when it's actually convincing and you buy it and you feel like you can relate to what that character is feeling, even if maybe you wouldn't feel the same way, or maybe you would, or even if it's maybe like quote unquote wrong person to feel that way about, or maybe it is the wrong person, and all of that is like really crafty if it's done well.
Ari, is there a particular reason this book speaks to you as a summer read?
I think because I think that summer is where you want to have a little fun,
a little steaminess,
I think about romance in the summer, like whether it is serious or not, or even if you're a person in a relationship, like a fun steamy vacation or like a fun date night. Like I just always think about summer. Like it's something about when the weather, I think because we live in Chicago and it's kind of cold, and in the wintertime I think most people kind of hibernate during the winter. Like we put on a whole bunch of sweats and we layer up and we stay inside, right? And then as soon as that weather starts to break, people are like, I got my outfits, I immediately was like, oh, I got date night dresses. Okay, this is a date night dress, this is a date night dress. I ain't got no dates lined up, but I got the dresses for whenever that happens, right?
So I think that hot girl summer, hot girl book.
I got the hot girl summer dresses for the hot girl book. Yes. So I think that's why it really just kind of feels, and there are fun, like, even with the grief parts, I think it's still fun. Like, there's still fun feelings, and, the feeling of, when you really like somebody and they give you butterflies, like, that's a fun feeling. And I mean, the goal, of course, is to be with somebody who still gives you those butterflies. So it's not like just for new people, but like, it's just a fun feeling, and it makes me feel like summertime.
Nice. It's a great answer.
In the summer, even sort of like it gets you halfway to those butterflies. I feel like like you can just be in the mood. Although there's also the like summer like beach bod anxiety too. Like I always do a bunch of sprints and crunches in May when I lived in Chicago, trying to get my promontory point bod together.
I used to, but then like the summertime is just, you look up and you're like, well, it's here, and I look like how I look, so let's just go with it. Okay, let's just roll. Yeah.
Well, and that person who's going to give you butterflies your whole life is not going to be someone who's judging you on your beach bod.
Exactly. Because generally, you might not think you look great, and then somebody will just say, wow, you look just so amazing, and then you're like, it doesn't matter. And then you're running because you feel happy. Like, you're not even running because you're just like out on the lakefront running. Right, you're frolicking. Good morning, hello. Oh, how are you? Yes, no, I went on a date last night and someone told me I look beautiful. Yes. Oh, hello. Yes, hello, everyone.
I saw you with that kind of energy at WBEZ every once in a while. I feel like you came into that building with that kind of frolicking energy.
I probably had some good days. I had some good dates during those years on occasion.
Ari, I think you have a reading. Is that right?
Okay, I got a short one.
Okay, yeah. Let's hear it.
Faye avoided Alim for the next few days. The rest of their walk back to the house hadn't been awkward, but once Faye was alone in her room, under the beating pulse of her shower, she had burst into tears. It hurt the way Alim had pulled away from her at the peak, closing himself off. She kept remembering how quickly he'd scrambled to his feet, like she was something he shouldn't have been touching. And even though that was technically true, it still made Faye feel like shit.
That's a good one. I want to read that book.
Yeah.
I'm going to send it to you.
That's on my list now.
That's the dad, right? She's referring to the dad of the, yeah.
That's the dad.
The dad's playing hard to get a little bit. He's not, or maybe he's just not sure how he feels about it.
He trying to respect, because he like, I don't want her my son,
Yeah.
He,
you
like,
get
he's
pretty hard to
attracted.
get when you're the dad, right? You're just,
you're right. Good point.
You just got to not, right?
He's being respectful of the regular boundaries in this situation.
Mm-hmm.
So we actually, one of the things we like to do is trivia. And Chris and I both prepped trivia questions for this one, which I guess what we'll do, normally we quiz each other, but I think in this case, we should just throw the trivia out to everybody and everybody can guess. It's not worth anything. Like you don't get any prize or anything like that. So it's just bragging rights.
That's
Susie's really good.
I'm not going to win, so that's fine.
So Akwaeke Emezi has said that they think of themselves as an Ogbanje. I'm sure I'm butchering that pronunciation, which are believed to be spirits that plague families with misfortune. And so I'm looking for the literal translation of the term Ogbanje. It's a multiple choice. So here are your three choices of the literal translation. The literal translation of the term means A, a woman who guards the entrance to another world. B, the cause of death on earth. Or C, children who come and go. Okay, we have all three of our answers. Ari has picked A. A woman who guards the entrance to another world, and both Susie and Jesse have picked children who come and go,
which I think is right.
And the correct answer is C.
C?
Children who come and go.
we low expectationed it. We worked the low expectation.
Okay,
after I hit it, I was like, I don't think.
Yeah.
You guys have jumped out to an early lead. Susie and Jesse have 1, and Chris and Ari have 0.
Well, I'm not going to guess in the next one, so I'm only going to have 1 total. But mine was
yes,
also...
the hosts can only possibly perhaps tie. And what's a tie like, Jesse?
Oh, tie is like kissing your sister.
There you go.
I also picked a trivia question that was inspired by You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty. And actually, Arionne, you alluded perfectly. The plot synopsis, I can tell that it's like a pretty heavy book about identity and about sort of figuring out who they are after a tragedy, making sense of that. But it does have that kind of structure you were alluding earlier of a woman whose maybe initial relationship or marriage hasn't gone as well as they hoped, and maybe they're getting a little bit older, and then they like try to find themselves, and they go on a voyage of self-discovery, and they end up in a tropical locale and meet a stranger. So the outline reminded me of that kind of couple other books in that genre. And your question is, I'm going to name 3 books, and your question is, which of these books does not have an important moment in which the protagonist meets a man from another country in a tropical locale and has sex? So it's the book in which that does not happen of these.
I got it.
Specifically tropical?
Tropical, or I should say tropical or a tropical-like setting. It might not typically be between the tropics, but the sort of climate we associate with tropical conditions. How about that? So is the book that does not have Sex in the Tropics with a Stranger A, How Stella Got Her Groove Back by Terry McMillan, B, Shirley Valentine, which is a play written by Willie Russell that they made into a movie, or C, Eat, Pray, Love by Elizabeth Gilbert, or D, none of the above?
Okay, let me ask a quick question. And again, you said that like, if it's like vacation, does that count as tropical?
It has,
or does it have to be like tropical?
It doesn't have to be literally the tropics, but a warm, sunny location.
Okay.
And if we were to choose D, that means all of the books have the aforementioned sex in a warm, sunny location.
Yes, and I will just say, to make it clear, the thing that is in doubt in this case is the sex with the stranger. All of these books involve a woman going to such a location. So if you're familiar with one of the books and you're like, is that location a tropical location? The answer is yes. For the sake of this quiz. Perfect. It might not technically be, between the 2 lines of tropic, but it is a tropical-like climate. It's a climatological term. Okay, so it looks like you've all chatted me. All right, so Arionne has chosen D, none of the above, meaning that all of the books have such a scene. Susie has also chatted me D, none of the above, meaning all of the books. And Chris has chatted me B, Shirley Valentine. And the answer is, of course, none of the above. All of those books have a female protagonist going to a tropical location, meeting a man, often with a very interesting name, like Winston Shakespeare or Costas Dimitriades. Or in the case of Elizabeth Gilbert, Brazilian businessman. I don't think she ever names him. And that's nonfiction. All of those books do, in fact, feature that plot point.
Yeah, because that's what I was asking about. I was like, so, Elizabeth Gilbert, is she in the tropics? Okay.
Well, so that part happened, I thought that part happened in, where does she meet the guy? Wasn't that in Indonesia that she meets the guy?
I wasn't sure. I couldn't remember. So that's why I was like, that could be. But when you said they're all hot, I said, okay, well. Sex is the
I think she meets him in Indonesia, which technically is the tropics, but it was definitely like on her trip. And I believe, if I'm wrong that it was in a warm location, I apologize.
Gotcha. I only usually remember Italy just because, like, it's the videos or like the movie of Julia Roberts eating the pasta.
Yeah, so she ate the pasta, and then she went to India and meditated, and then I think she went to Indonesia and met the guy. That's my recollection.
Yeah, because I figured. Eat,
that's
pray,
the love part.
Love.
Yeah. Yeah, eat, pray, love in that order, right?
Mm-hmm.
Susie, Ari, how do people who want to follow your work do so?
I am everywhere at Arionne Nettles, ARIONNENETTLES. Really, really long, too many N's, but it's me.
Everywhere, like every
Everywhere, all the places.
Susie, how do people follow your work?
You can follow me on Instagram at SUSIEAN. I mean, I guess I'm on Twitter, but I'm not active on Twitter. But if you want to follow someone who rarely posts, I'm at SOOSIEON. And that's it.
You could also check out Curious City or Shoes Off, which are podcasts in the world that somebody could listen to.
Oh, yeah. There's also those things as well.
I recommend both of them. Listeners, thanks for listening. You can also follow us at Upper Middle Pod on Twitter, Upper Middle Brow on Instagram, or you can follow the podcast at uppermiddlebrow.com on the plain old internets.
And Upper Middle Brow is a Small Point production. Chris Bagg and Jesse Dukes are the creators and hosts, and we are the Beach Readers. This week's guests are Susie An and Arionne Nettles. Music is by Ben Pajak and Jesse Dukes. Design and website by me, Chris Bagg. You can learn more about us at uppermiddlebrow.com. Thanks for listening, everybody. And Susie and Arionne, thank you so much for joining us at Upper Middle Brow.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
us.
All right, listeners, and there's a sound of summer. Summer on the way here in the Piedmont foothills of Virginia. I don't know if those are spring peepers or some kind of cricket-type insect, to be honest, but it's a sound that I associate with the late spring, early summer, the approach of the hot season. There's also a pool down the hill from where I'm staying. And I think what we're going to do is give you one more summer reading episode. We'd only planned on two, but this was such a great discussion. Chris and I wanted to save our recommendations for each other and for you for a separate episode. And we got some wonderful voice memos and other recommendations from some of you, our listeners, that we also want to share with everybody. So that's coming up pretty soon. So listen for that wherever you get Upper Middle Brow, and thank you again. I'll leave you with a few more sounds of June. Unfortunately, it sounds like somebody's got a leaf blower or something going. My least favorite sound of June. Oh, I think that's a game of beach volleyball. That's not so bad. I believe that was a red-bellied woodpecker. Lucky you.